All right, well, the harvesting and food processing continues. My next step is to tackle some Roma tomatoes. If you saw my earlier video on bed preparation, this was the bed that I prepped, and I prepped it specifically for doing canning tomatoes. I've already picked a bowl full that are inside. I'm about to pick a few more of these ripe ones, and then I'm going to go inside and can them. So I'm going to take you through each process along the way, so stay tuned, and I'm about to get started. Okay, and these are the tomatoes that I just harvested. I'm using Roma tomatoes this year as my canning tomatoes. First step is to wash off the tomatoes with a soft bristled brush. Prior to canning tomatoes, the skins have to be removed from the tomatoes first. It's much easier to remove the skin if the tomatoes are put in boiling water for 1 minute. Because I have so many tomatoes, I'm going to use this large turkey fryer and submerge the tomatoes down into the boiling water inside this fryer. While doing all this, I also need to prepare my jars. They've already been washed, and so now I'm going to put them in the oven at 200 degrees for at least 20 minutes. This is the brand of lids that I will be using for the jars. I want to point out that modern lids typically do not require boiling first, and the directions here only call for washing them prior to using them. Now that the water's boiling, it's time to put the tomatoes into the boiling water. I typically let them sit for a minute, but I also just watch them to watch for any cracks or blistering of the skin, which is when I know they're ready. Hopefully you can see that some of these tomatoes are starting to blister, so these are almost ready to come out of the boiling water. This turkey fryer comes with a basket that can be lifted up out of the pot, and then the pot can be removed, and then I want to quickly cool the tomatoes by running cold water over them. The next step is to remove the skins. These Roma tomatoes make for very quick and easy de-skinning because all you do is cut the tip off, pull the skins off, and then discard the skin. And then what I typically do is quarter the fruit, and then it's ready to go into a jar. And of course you repeat this process for all the tomatoes that you plan to can, which takes a while. Once some progress has been made on the tomatoes, I stop and get the canner ready. I begin by adding 3 quarts of water and then put it on the heat to heat up the water. 2 tablespoons of white vinegar is added to the water in the bottom of the canner, which helps to keep the jars themselves from staining. And now it's time to start filling the jars. With tomatoes, you first want to add either citric acid or lemon juice. In this case, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. Then I'll add a teaspoon of salt. A full teaspoon is used when quart-sized jars are being used. Now, using my funnel, I will just start adding the tomatoes into the jar until there's about a 1/2 inch of headspace left at the top. The spatula is used for setting the headspace. Each tooth represents a length starting at 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch. This recipe calls for a 1/2 inch headspace, So by using the spatula, I'm going to pour more tomatoes until I get it right at a 1/2 inch headspace. The recipes for this particular canning say to add boiling water to make this 1/2 inch headspace. In this case, because there's already so much liquid in the jar, I'm going to fill it to the mark that I want and then put the entire jar into the canning bath, which is already boiling, so that before I apply the lids, this liquid will be hot enough to be boiling. In other jars, there may not be enough liquid at the top, so in this case, what I'll do is, again, using my 1/2 inch measuring, I will add boiling water to the top of the jar, as I'm doing here. But even when adding the boiling water to the top, I still put the jar back in the bath so that it will be heating up until I'm ready to put the lids on. Now any trapped air in the jars need to be removed by inverting the spatula and running it throughout the tomatoes. Usually after removing air, the level will drop a little bit and a little bit more boiling water will have to be added to create that 1/2 inch headspace. Now without boiling them, I've had the lids sitting in this warm water so that they're now ready to use. I use this magnet to get them out of the hot water. Now the lid is just placed on top of the jar and the band is screwed in place to finger tightness. One of the most important safety features prior to putting the lid on is to hold it up to the light to make sure that light can be seen coming through the hole in the top. Now the lid can be put in place. The arrows on the top are first lined up and then the top is twisted into place. Now the heat is adjusted on the counter so that there's a steady stream of steam coming up through the opening in the top. Once there's a steady stream, then a timer can be set for 10 minutes in which you allow it to steam. This recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure for 10 minutes. The pressure weight is determined by these tops. The top itself is 5 pounds and each ring is an additional 5 pounds. Since this recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure, 1 ring is added to the top, which equals 10 pounds of pressure. Once the 10 minutes is up, it's time to put the weight on top of the canner. Once the weight is in place, you wait for the plunger on the back of the canner to come up, which in this case, I got very lucky. It popped up almost right away. Once the plunger comes up, there is a variable time from the time the plunger comes up until the weight starts rocking. When the weight starts rocking, that's when the next timer is set. Now that it's rocking, it's time to set the timer for 10 minutes because again, this recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure for 10 minutes. The heat is adjusted so that the weight just gives a gentle rocking motion throughout the canning process. Once the time is up, all that you do is remove the canner from the heat and let it cool. Do not try to speed this process. The plunger in the back has to go down before the lid can be removed. Trying to speed up this process can cause the glass jars to break. Now that the plunger is down, the lid can be removed and the jars can be taken out of the canner to cool. When removing the lid, pull the lid toward your face so that the steam will go away from your face. The jars should be placed on towels to cool. Now all that's left to do is allow the jar to cool. As it cools, the lids will form a seal. After they have cooled off enough for you to touch them, you can check the lids to make sure that there's a good seal. Any that aren't sealed well need to be used immediately or put in the refrigerator. After washing off the jars, they're ready for storage. It's important that they are stored without the bands in place so that any faulty seals can be seen. Well, that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching this video on canning tomatoes. Have a good rest of the day.